Good morning, everyone. We'll get started with Sunday school. If you're, we don't have handouts today. I know some people have already asked me about it. Hopefully, it's not disorienting. We're going to do something a little bit different today. We're not having our normal. Hi, Asher. It's okay, bud. We're not doing our normal lesson. We're going to have an update about how General Assembly went. You know, if you've not noticed, I haven't been around the past few weeks. One of the reasons was that I was on vacation. We went to Hawaii, which was amazing, for a week. And then we came back. Some of you might have seen me. Like, I popped in and out for a second. And then we went to General Assembly, which was in Tennessee, in Chattanooga. And that's the National Assembly of our denomination, the PCA. So I wanted to give you an update about how that went and what's going on with the denomination. Hopefully give you some encouragement about that. I was encouraged throughout the whole process. I mean, it was really cool. So we went to Hawaii, and we were there over a Sunday. So we worshiped with a PCA church in Hawaii. And then we went to GA, and we had to travel there on Sunday because I had to be there on Monday. It was not ideal, but we were able to catch an evening service in Tennessee at a PCA church there. It was really cool to be able to do that. Opposite sides of the country, worshiping with saints that we are in communion with in the PCA. I was really encouraged by it. Very different experiences, obviously. In Hawaii, we were thinking we were going to be like 10 minutes late for the service, and so we roll up like maybe 5 minutes late, and we walk in. They didn't start for another 20 minutes after we got there, and they ended like 2 hours later. It was a wild experience. Definitely island time. Yeah. And then in Tennessee, we showed up 5 minutes late, and they were like halfway through the service. So let's pray before we get into it and pray for our Lord's blessing over our denomination. Our great God and Savior, we thank you for the grace that you've shown us in Jesus Christ, that you have reconciled us to yourself through his blood and given us peace through his work of redemption, and that you've accepted us because of his righteousness that he's offered up on our behalf. And we thank you that you've also given us the gift of reconciliation with each other, that you've given us community with one another as Christians, that you've called us to live in connection, not with just other Christians, but with other churches. And so we thank you for the PCA and that we have the opportunity to be connected with other churches all around the country and all around the world through this denomination. We thank you for the work that we were able to do this year at General Assembly, and we ask that that work would bring glory to your name and blessing to your church. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So if you remember, we're trying to do like a new thing with Sunday school. We're doing like quarterly series. So the first one was the Westminster Confession of Faith. And then we went to biblical literacy, which we just finished up. And now we're going to go to Reformed piety and practice, which will be really practical things like, prayer, potentially something about virtue or ethics. And then I'm going to teach a few lessons on polity, which is church government. Like, how does practically church government work in a Reformed church? This lesson on General Assembly kind of kicks that off, and I think it's a good way to start. It's a very, hands-on, practical, how does polity happen in Reformed churches and Presbyterian churches? So I'll start by just orienting us to what General Assembly is for those who aren't familiar, and then we'll talk about what happened at this year's General Assembly. So we're Presbyterians, right? It's in our name, the Spring Meadows Presbyterian Church. And Presbyterian, the word comes from the Greek word presbyteros, which just means elder. So Presbyterian Church is a elder-led church. That's kind of what defines our polity, at least, that we're led by elders. And a presbytery is a group or council of elders. And that word actually occurs in the New Testament. It's a very biblical thing to have a presbytery, a council of elders. And every one of our governing bodies is a presbytery. Our session, the session of Spring Meadows Presbyterian Church is our elders and our deacons. That is a council of elders. It's a presbytery, technically. And then our regional governing body is we call it the presbytery, and that's a council of all the elders from the churches in our region. And then the General Assembly, which is what we're talking about today, the General Assembly is the council of elders from all the churches in our denomination. So they're all councils of elders. It's just the scope of each council. We have the session, which is one church, the presbytery, which is a region of churches, and then the General Assembly is all of the churches in the country, in the denomination. The General Assembly meets once a year, usually in June, to discuss and decide on matters that affect the whole church. So the session, we usually meet every month. We take a month off here and there, but we meet to discuss matters that affect our church. The presbytery meets usually 3 times a year, and we meet to discuss matters that affect all the churches in our region. And then the General Assembly meets once a year to consider matters that affect the whole church, all of the churches in the denomination. But that reality, because we only meet once a year, and it's such a large assembly because it's all of the elders in the denomination, all of the churches in the denomination. Because of those two things, most of our work is done through committees. It'd be really impractical to do the majority of the work at the assembly floor because this year there were 2,300 commissioners, meaning 2,300 teaching elders and ruling elders from all of the churches. That's a really big meeting. And so to decide things like budgets and personnel decisions from the floor, completely would be really impractical and difficult. And we only meet once a year, so we wouldn't be able to carry out the things that we decide on. So we meet, most of our work is done through committees, and then the assembly meets, and we hear reports and recommendations from those committees, and we make decisions about those reports and recommendations as the assembly. We have 10 permanent committees and agencies, and these are things that you're probably familiar with, but you might not realize that they're committees of the General Assembly. So MTW, Mission to the World, is a committee of General Assembly. It's our mission, our global mission organization. Reformed University Fellowship is a committee of the General Assembly. That's our college ministry. The Administrative Committee is the Committee of General Assembly. They do things, they run By Faith, the online magazine, and they plan and run a lot of the meetings of the other committees and things like that. They plan the General Assembly. It's a very big endeavor. Covenant College and Covenant Seminary are agencies of the General Assembly, and so we hear reports from them and we vote on their recommendations. We also have a standing judicial commission which conducts church discipline trials at the GA level. So a church discipline trial could start at the session, and then it could go up to the presbytery if it's appealed, and then it could go up to General Assembly, and if it did that, then it would be heard at the SJC, the Standing Judicial Commission. And then once a year, committees of commissioners meet before General Assembly, and these are committees to oversee our permanent committees. Now that's like probably the most Presbyterian thing you've ever heard. We have committees to oversee our committees, right? But for example, MTW has a permanent committee that meets several times throughout the year, and then they have a committee of commissioners which meets right before GA and reviews the report and recommendations of the permanent committee, and they give their own report and recommendation to the assembly. We also have a Review of Presbytery Records Committee, RPR, Review of Presbytery Records. They look at all of the minutes from all of the meetings, from all of the presbyteries, and then they make notes about anything that needs to be corrected, whether it's a correction of how it was recorded or a correction of what was actually done. And that sounds boring. It's about minutes and reviewing minutes, but they actually catch some really important and serious things, and so that can be pretty important when that comes to the floor of General Assembly. 2 more to note: the nominating committee. The nominating committee presents nominations of elders to serve on our permanent committees. So you might think, well, who gets to decide who serves on the board of Covenant College? And the answer is it's the General Assembly, and our nominating committee gives us those nominees that might serve on, Covenant College committee or the administrative committee. Like, who gets to decide who serves on the MTW committee? It's the General Assembly, and they get those nominees mainly through the nominating committee. And lastly, the Overtures Committee. The Overtures Committee. What is an overture? An overture is a written request for the General Assembly to do something, usually to change the book of church order, or to make a statement about something controversial, or to start a study committee. It's kind of like a bill. That's what an overture is. It's kind of like a bill. And the Overtures Committee reviews all of the overtures for the year and makes recommendations about them to the General Assembly. So hopefully those definitions will help us orient ourselves as we're learning about this year's General Assembly. Of course, I'm happy to take questions throughout if I say anything that's confusing. There are a lot of abbreviations, so I could accidentally say some things that you might not know the definition of. So please, ask questions if needed, but hopefully those things orient us. So what happened at General Assembly this year? Well, General Assembly doesn't officially start until Tuesday night. I told you earlier that we traveled out on Sunday because I had to be there on Monday, but the assembly doesn't start until Tuesday night. Before Tuesday night, the committees are meeting. That's basically what happens. So Monday morning, some of the committees start to meet, and they meet until Tuesday night when the assembly starts, basically. So I was on the Overtures Committee again. That's what I did last year as well. So we started Monday morning at 10. And there were 50 total overtures that were submitted to the assembly. I think 2 of them were retracted. So there were 48 total overtures to deal with, and the Overtures Committee had to deal with 37 of them, which is a lot. Some of the other ones were sent mainly to Mission to North America, MNA, dealing with the boundaries of different presbyteries. Some of them might have been sent to the administrative committee, but the Overtures Committee had to deal with 37 overtures, and compare that to last year, there were 29 that we had to deal with. So there were a lot more this year, and a good amount of them were fairly controversial with pretty weighty issues. And so last year, we finished our Overtures Committee on Tuesday before lunch, and we were pretty close to finishing on Monday before dinner. This year, we didn't finish until 5 p.m. on Tuesday. So we almost ran out of time. We almost had to meet on Wednesday, but we were able to finish really quickly before the assembly started on Tuesday. So there was a lot of work to do. We'll talk about the overtures towards the end. But that's what I was doing all day Monday and all day Tuesday. And then General Assembly itself starts Tuesday with a worship service. I think it started at 6:30 p.m. on Tuesday. There was a worship service. There's also a worship service on Wednesday night and Thursday night. So there's a lot of worship that happens at General Assembly. It's not just business. It's not just like a conference where you hear speakers and things like that. There are legitimate worship services with sermons preached every night. And again, this year, there were something like 2,300 commissioners. But you add, their family that might have come, their wife and kids, and visitors that are welcome to come. There were a lot of people. I mean, my guess might be at least 4,000 people total at General Assembly. And so at opening worship, it was so packed that they had to go to overflow seating. And some people were kicked out of overflow seating because the fire marshal was like, there are too many people in this room. You can't have this many people. There's a fire hazard here. So there was a ton of people. It was the biggest General Assembly ever. Not enough seats in the room, which I think is an encouraging thing. So the previous year's moderator opens the service with preaching, and so that was a ruling elder, Steve Dowling. He preached, which was a good sermon. And then after worship, we elect a new moderator. This year we elected Kevin DeYoung, which I thought was pretty exciting. And he did a fantastic job. He had to deal with a lot of difficult moments. Steve Dowling last year we finished General Assembly Thursday at 3 p.m., which is a pretty light load. We finished pretty quickly. This year we finished Thursday at 10 p.m., if not 10:30 p.m. So there were some difficult things that took a long time, but I think Kevin DeYoung did a fantastic job moderating. Some of the other things we did on Tuesday night was voting on some overtures. So this is kind of confusing, but if an overture wants to change the book of church order, it has to pass 3 votes. It has to pass 1 vote at General Assembly. Then it gets sent to all of the presbyteries, and they vote on all of them independently, and it has to pass 2/3 of all the presbyteries. And then it has to pass a second vote at General Assembly, so the next year. So it takes 2 years total, 3 votes. And this year we had 4 overtures that were changing the Book of Church Order from last General Assembly. And so we kind of finalized those and ratified those. We passed all of them. They weren't overly exciting. I think one of them is probably interesting to most people. It expanded who could represent a church member in a church discipline case. So church discipline is kind of a difficult process. It's kind of complicated. And the average church member has never even seen a Book of Church Order. If they went into my office, they might not be able to point it out on my bookshelf. So imagine trying to navigate church discipline as somebody who's never read our process of church discipline. It's confusing for me as a pastor, and it's so much more confusing for somebody who's never read the book. And so previously, we allowed a church member who's under discipline to be represented and have, advice, basically, almost similar to a lawyer, but not a lawyer. But it was restricted to only a member of your church. Only a member of your church. And then I think if it was, there were kind of different levels. But if you were if you were under church discipline, under trial at your church, only another member of your church. And how many polity experts does a given church have? Maybe one if you're lucky. So we voted this year, we finalized the overture to amend that part of our BCO to expand that to any member in the same presbytery. So if a person is under church discipline in our church, they could reach out. There might be a list, ideally, of names that could help in all of the churches in our presbytery. And then if it goes up to the General Assembly, then any church member in the PCA could represent that person. So I think that's a positive thing. It helps people. It helps the accused. It helps people who might be being abused by church discipline to get help and representation there. So we finalized that. That'll go into the PCO this year. We also voted on 2 overtures that would have changed how the rules of General Assembly, how we operate as a General Assembly. And they both failed because they require a 2/3 vote, and they both got a majority vote, but not a 2/3 majority. One of those would have prevented the General Assembly's stated clerk from collecting ethnicity data from churches about church members. That was a kind of controversial thing this year. The stated clerk said, we're going to start collecting age and ethnicity data about church members, and a lot of people weren't happy about that. That overture to change the rules of operation didn't pass, but there was another overture to just simply tell the stated clerk not to do that, not to collect ethnicity data, and that one passed. So he's not going to do it. It wasn't codified in our rules of operation. The second overture to do that kind of a thing was to require that presbyteries keep directories of ruling elders and deacons. Currently, presbyteries are required to keep directories of teaching elders, pastors, and this overture said, well, you should do that with the ruling elders and deacons too, and that seemed reasonable to me, but it did not pass. It was I think 4% short of 2/3 vote, something like that. So it's pretty close, but it didn't pass. I'm convinced it didn't pass just because people didn't understand what it was trying to do. There were a lot of speeches where I was listening to them and I was like, you have not understood the purpose of this overture. So that one did not pass. So that's what we did Tuesday. The main things we did were elect a moderator, then we voted on last year's overtures, and then we voted on a few overtures to change how the assembly operates. Then we reconvened early Wednesday morning, I think 8:30 on Wednesday. We got back, we heard various reports from different committees. We also got to hear from fraternal delegates from other denominations. That's one of the highlights of General Assembly, is to hear, we have people from the OPC, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, the Reformed Presbyterian Church in America, the RPC. We have some representatives from churches all around the world. Last year we had representatives from the Presbyterian Church in Brazil and in Mexico, I think. And then I think this year we had a representative from a Korean Presbyterian church. So it's really encouraging to hear from those other denominations, to hear how they're doing, and then to hear their greetings and to get to, be encouraged mutually by that brotherhood that we have with other Reformed denominations. But the main business on Wednesday was to hear the report of the Review of Presbytery Records, RPR. So hopefully you remember what I said about them. They're looking at all of the minutes from all of the meetings from all of the presbyteries and then giving us recommendations. I think it's like 200 pages, the whole report. I skimmed it. But some people read it really thoroughly, and they were not happy about certain parts of the report, and they came to the assembly and were ready to debate the report. And so we spent a few hours debating about minutes at the General Assembly, which, that's kind of what it's like to be Presbyterian, debating minutes for hours and hours. So for example, what happens is the RPR, they look at all the minutes and they say, okay, here's an exception to the minutes. Here's something that didn't quite go the way it should have gone. And then what the presbytery has to do is just respond and say, hey, we either agree or we disagree. We agree we didn't do that right. Here's how we're making amends. We're sorry we won't do that in the future. Or we don't agree. This is what we did. We actually did it right. This is, whatever. It seems like a lot of people don't necessarily understand that process, and so they come to the General Assembly and they're like, okay, here's an exception that was given to our minutes. We're going to just argue about it from the floor of the assembly instead of following that process of giving a response, explaining these things. So, for example, one presbytery transferred a pastor's ordination into the Episcopal Church. And RPR said, you should not have done that. The Episcopal Church is not a member of the visible church. They're not a faithful gospel-preaching church. And some elders were not happy about that. They said, basically, it's the presbytery's business. You should butt out. It's not up to the General Assembly to make that decision. But during that debate, I Googled the Episcopal Church, and I looked at their website and front page, big rainbow banner. So I was happy to vote in favor of the committee recommendation, and that actually passed, which was a good thing. Another presbytery allowed a pastor to take an exception about who could be ordained. The pastor said, I believe that women can be ordained. Our denomination says only men can be ordained, and the presbytery allowed the pastor to take an exception on that, I think assuming that he wouldn't do anything about it, like he wouldn't ordain any women. But the RPR said, no, you shouldn't have done that. That's a pretty big difference of belief. And so despite all the debate, despite the hours of back and forth and, substitute motions and parliamentary procedures and all these things, we didn't really change anything about the RPR report. So we passed all of the committee's recommendations. And I agreed with, I think, all of them. So I think it was a good thing. It just took a long time to get there. That was the main thing we did on Wednesday. We heard those reports. We debated those things. And I think pretty much by overwhelming majority, we went with the committee's recommendations on that. Then we came back Thursday morning. I think 8 a.m. we got back Thursday morning. Wednesday evening, we end kind of early on Wednesday. We have a worship service at like 6:30, and then the rest of the evening, I think the intention is to leave it open for fellowship. Since we were in Chattanooga, where Covenant College is nearby, it's in Lookout Mountain. They hosted a picnic, so my family went there, went to Covenant College, got to tour around, which was really enjoyable. Got to point out to Asher, hey, this is where you're going to college someday. Maybe. So then we came back Thursday morning and we heard some more committee reports, things like Geneva benefits. They're the ones that run my retirement account. Other committees, MTW, we heard their reports. But the main two things that happened on Thursday were the nominating committee and the overtures committee. Those are the two big things, the nominating committee and the overtures committee. So remember, again, from the kind of intro I gave, the nominating committee brings a list of names of elders that they think are qualified to serve on the various committees and agencies. Again, like MTW, RUF, MNA, all these things. But elders at the assembly are allowed to bring floor nominations of men that they think are more qualified, or maybe there was an empty slot that the nominating committee wasn't able to fill, and so floor nominations can fill that, which ends up being really confusing because you're making these votes on you have little bios, 200-word biographies of these men and their qualifications, and you have to make decisions about them. And like some of them you have never heard of before. Some of the names you were able to read ahead of General Assembly, but some of them are floor nominations, and so you have to read them like as the votes are happening, and you're making decisions between these elders and who's more qualified. It can be really complicated, and it happens really fast. This year there was something like 30 floor nominations, I think, which is a lot, and 9 of them passed, which I think is more than usual. Thankfully, I was sitting next to my friend who was on the nominating committee, and so he was able to help me navigate those votes and help tell me which nominee he thought was more qualified, since he had done all of the background work on that. So that went well. It was fast, but there were some good names that were nominated, I think. And then after lunch, we started with the Overtures Committee report. And so I said after lunch. We were supposed to start at 10 a.m. with Overtures Committee. We started after lunch, which I think was 1:30. So we started late, and we had 37 overtures to deal with. We had 2 minority reports. And a minority report is when a significant minority of the Overtures Committee doesn't agree with what the majority voted on, and so they are able to bring a report to the assembly and say, no, I think we should have done this differently. And each minority report adds at least an hour of debate to the General Assembly. So we had a lot to do after lunch on Thursday. I was worried we might not even finish on Thursday, but thankfully we did. We finished at 10:30 on Thursday. So we don't have time to cover all of the overtures, obviously. We dealt with 37 of them, but we'll discuss a few of them, some that I think were most notable. So first, Overture 9 ended up being really controversial, and that was one of the minority reports. Overture 9 was trying to amend the Book of Church Order to change the membership of our administrative committee. I did not expect that to be controversial, but we debated it for 2 hours at the Overtures Committee. So currently, this is how it works. Our administrative committee has 11 members that are elected by General Assembly. It follows that process that I've just explained. The nominating committee gives their recommendations, and then we vote on the names, and then they end up as members of the administrative committee. And again, the administrative committee, they plan General Assembly, they run By Faith Online, they plan a lot of the other meetings throughout the year. They do a lot of really good work for the denomination. It's a pretty important, a lot of weighty stuff that they do, influential in the denomination. So currently 11 members are elected by the assembly directly, but then 9 other members are appointed by the other permanent committees. It's kind of confusing, but so, for example, the General Assembly might elect 1 elder to serve on the MTW committee, and then the MTW committee will say, okay, great, we recognize these gifts in this person, and so we're going to appoint him to serve on the administrative committee too. And so there's kind of this roundabout way where a lot of people on the administrative committee are not elected by the General Assembly for that work of being on the administrative committee. They're still elected by the General Assembly, but they might be elected to do MTW work, but not administrative work. This overture argued that it's not right for that to be that way. If the General Assembly wanted a man to serve on the administrative committee, then they would have elected him to do that. And I think I ultimately agreed with the intent of the overture, but there was a lot of potential for unintended consequences. There were like budgetary implications to this. There's the implication of currently the committee is at least 20 people, and if you bring it down to just 11, that almost consolidates power even more to a smaller group of people. So maybe we should expand the number. So there were a lot of potential for unintended consequences. It was really complex. Again, we debated it for 2 hours. And ultimately, the committee voted to refer it back to Presbytery. And all that means is we're going to tell the Presbytery that sent us the overture, hey, we think this is good, but it needs some work. Come back to us with improved language. We're not saying no, but we're not saying yes. We're saying not yet. Needs some work. Maybe next year, yeah. But the minority report argued that we should just answer it in the affirmative right away. But General Assembly voted with the committee. They voted against the minority report, so we voted to refer it back. So that might come back later, but we spent a lot of time on it. The other overture that had a minority report was Overture 12, and this would have changed the BCO to require that elders or deacons are the ones to serve the bread and the wine of the Lord's Supper. So basically, yeah, it would have said, like, as the minister is administrating the sacraments, then he can, pass the elements to, an officer of the church, and then they can distribute it to the church members. Just to make that explicit. It's almost implied right now, but to make it explicit. The committee recommended to pass it, but the minority report was to answer no and to say we should not make this change to our BCO. And ultimately, the minority report won the day. So the assembly passed the minority report, and so we answered this overture in the negative. Why did that happen? There was a lot of concern that this would be too restrictive. There was some concern that we would be requiring churches to do something that the Bible doesn't require churches to do. Right, there were some churches that were saying, well, what happens if we don't have enough elders or if we don't have any elders? I was not convinced by any of those concerns, honestly. Like, if you don't have elders, then stand up here and have everybody come up, and you serve everybody yourself as a pastor. If you don't have a pastor, you can't have Lord's Supper anyways, right? So that's already a concern if you don't have a pastor. But if you don't have elders, I think the pastor can make do. And I think most churches are like us. Most churches have our elders, our ruling elders stand up front and they serve the communion. I think that's right because it acknowledges that the session is entrusted with church discipline and with the sacraments. Only elders know if there's a person in the congregation who shouldn't be taking the Lord's Supper because they've been under church discipline and they've been suspended from the sacraments. If you have just, some churches are a little bit more open with who serves communion, and so they might have even children serving communion. That happens in the PCA. In which case the child doesn't know if the person grabbing the elements should be doing that or not. But if an elder's there, he'll know and he'll be able to address that circumstance. So I think ultimately the positives would have outweighed the negatives. But it was a very close vote, about 100 votes or so, maybe like 140 votes. But we did not pass it. A similar overture could come back in the future. There's one other thing that might affect that I'll talk about later. But yeah, ultimately, I do think that doing nothing is better than doing something potentially bad. So it's better to be cautious, but I think this would have been a good change that we weren't able to pass, but always next year. There were 3 overtures this year to address a controversial issue in church discipline, and that issue is how do you elevate a church censure? So if a person has been under church discipline, they've been found guilty of a sin, and, for example, they have been suspended from the sacraments, so that they've been told, you're in unrepentant sin, you should not be taking the Lord's Supper for your own spiritual welfare until you repent. How do you then, if they continue in unrepentance for a long period of time and you're not able to get them to repent, how do you elevate that censure to excommunication? This came out of a presbytery where my good friend is a minister, and they had a pastor who was found guilty of a pretty serious sin. He was unrepentant. He said he wasn't guilty, but they found that he was. And he refused to communicate with the presbytery any further. So he was suspended from, I think he was deposed from his office, so he was no longer a pastor. He was suspended from the sacraments, and then he would not communicate with the presbytery any further. He was unrepentant. The presbytery said, they contacted him, and he said, I'm not talking to you guys anymore. And so then they met as a presbytery and just voted. And they voted to excommunicate that man. That was actually following established precedent in the PCA, that all you needed to do after somebody's already been found guilty, they've already been censured by the church, it was established precedent that the next step, if they continue to be unrepentant, would be just to vote as a session or a presbytery and elevate that censure to excommunication. But the SJC looked at this case from my friend's presbytery and said, no, you should not have done that, even though it was established precedent. You should have done something more than simply take a vote. And so there were a lot of different ideas about what we should do instead, and there were a lot of different overtures that were recommending different processes. But this year, General Assembly voted to pass an overture that would change the BCO and make it clear that if a court is going to elevate a censure, they need to notify the person who is being censured, and they need to hold a hearing where that person can give a defense. So basically, you need to give this person a chance to prove that they are repentant. And if they don't do that, then you're able to elevate that censure. And I think this was the right solution. Some overtures were trying to say that we need to have an entirely new trial every time you want to elevate a censure. And it's like, this person's already been found guilty. So why do we need to find them guilty through an entirely new trial again? All we need to establish is this guilty person has not repented. And so I think we made the right decision there. But again, we passed this year, but it needs to go to all of the presbyteries, and then it needs to come back next year to General Assembly. So it hasn't gone into effect yet, but we did pass it this year. So I think that was a positive thing. Just to clarify, what do we do? We thought we knew what we had to do, but that changed last year. So what do we actually do? So this will help bring clarity to that. I think this is my last. Yeah, there were two committees. There were two overtures that requested study committees this year. 2 study committees, and we actually established 2 study committees, which is pretty uncommon to do. That's actually the maximum amount of study committees that we can have at a given time. So we established 2 study committees. We'll talk about each of them. First, there were 4 overtures asking for a study committee on Christian nationalism. 4 different overtures. Going into it, I wasn't convinced it was necessary. In my mind, it was like, why do we need a whole committee just to say no? We don't like it. But there were several really convincing speeches from men at the Overtures Committee that convinced me to vote in favor of these study committees. They were pointing out how Christian nationalism is a growing issue in the church, especially online, especially among young men. And some flavors of Christian nationalism are becoming increasingly concerning. There is a good deal of racism that's becoming mixed in with Christian nationalism, especially online. Kinism, ethno-nationalism, things like this. And so there were a lot of good speeches pointing out, like, there's a serious pastoral concern here. There's a lot of men who are caught up in this. Some even extreme versions are like basically neo-Nazi, and they're describing themselves as Christian nationalism. So there were a lot of good speeches, and so we did 2 things as an assembly. First, we passed one amended overture, which repeated a statement made by another denomination called the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church, the ARP, not the AARP, the ARP. It repeated the statement made by their assembly, a statement that condemned any theological or political teaching which posits a superiority of race or ethnic identity born of immutable human characteristics. I think that was a really good statement to commend and say, we reject, unqualifiedly these potentially racist beliefs. And you can tell that this statement was needed because of how large of a negative response the statement has received on the internet. I recently got a Twitter account. I never had one before. But I was looking at the author of this statement from the ARP, his Twitter, and he posted something about the statement, and all of the comments were horribly negative. And I was like, wow, this was very needed. It's kind of sad to see that, but I'm glad that we made that statement. The second thing we did was we passed an overture that established a committee to study Christian nationalism, ethno-nationalism, and related teachings, and to advise on whether these teachings and formulations are in conformity with the system of doctrine taught in the Westminster Standards. And I think you can tell that study committee was needed because one elder stood up at the floor of General Assembly and tried to argue in favor of Christian nationalism from the Westminster Confession of Faith, which, he was trying to make it a speech against the overture, but I think it ended up being a speech in favor because we all saw that and were kind of shocked by it. So that committee will be made up of elders chosen by our moderator, Kevin DeYoung, which I think is a fantastic thing. I think he'll pick really good men for that. They'll study for a year, possibly more than a year, and then they'll report back to General Assembly and ideally give a lot of guidance and pastoral advice on how to evaluate Christian nationalism, because Christian nationalism, again, it comes in a lot of different flavors. It varies from something that is not too far from something we might agree with, and something that is bordering on racism, if not is racism. So it'll help us to evaluate the different kinds of Christian nationalism and how to respond pastorally to those situations, and whether or not if a pastor is teaching those things, whether or not he would need to be potentially under church discipline. I think hopefully they'll give a guidance on that. Not sure, but ideally they will. So that was the one study committee on Christian nationalism. The second study committee we formed has to do with worship. And so I need to give you some context for this. Our Book of Church Order has 3 sections. There's the form of government, the rule of discipline, and the directory of worship. 3 parts of our BCO, which is part of our Constitution. The third part of our Constitution, the directory of worship, has had a temporary statement attached to it for 50 years, which explains that it is not fully constitutional or authoritative. So for 50 years, we've had a temporary statement that has said that part of our Constitution is unconstitutional. Maybe not unconstitutional, but it's not fully constitutionally binding. This happened because the founding leaders of the PCA acknowledged that the directory needed some work. It wasn't fully ready to become, authoritative, and they didn't have time to work on it because they were founding a new denomination and they were revising all the other parts of the BCO. There have been several attempts in recent years to make parts of it binding, and so currently the chapters on the sacraments are binding, and one section of the chapter on marriage is binding. They couldn't even agree to the whole chapter on marriage, but they agreed to one section of it. So there's only there's 2 chapters and one section of another chapter that are binding. Last year, we almost passed an overture that would have made the chapter on preaching authoritative, but it didn't pass. It was maybe 40 votes or something like that. We couldn't pass that one. So going into this year, we had an overture to establish a committee to study our directory of worship, to make recommendations on how we could revise it, and then to bring it to the General Assembly to accept it as fully authoritative and to kind of get rid of that temporary statement. And I was excited by that, but I thought it was dead on arrival. It would never happen. We couldn't even pass the chapter on preaching, which if we could agree on anything, we should agree on preaching. We couldn't pass that last year, so no way we could pass this study committee this year. But we did, and it was kind of an overwhelming majority that passed this overture. It was I think it was 1,000 voted in favor and 500 voted against. So it was a pretty overwhelming majority voted to pass this study committee. So I have no idea how long it will take for them to go through each chapter, no idea how long it'll take for each chapter to be voted on, because remember, it takes 2 years to amend the BCO. But at some point in the next decade, Lord willing, we'll have a binding directory of worship, and all 3 parts of our Constitution will be fully constitutional. That was honestly the highlight of the assembly for me, that happened. It felt pretty historical. So I'll close with a little bit of reflection. Overall, I was really encouraged by General Assembly. I think the study committees and the statements that we made show that we're heading in the right direction as a denomination. Even when we were discussing difficult and controversial things, and there were very opposite opinions in the room, the debate was almost always civil and reflecting of Christian love. There was even one moment when an elder returned to the mic to apologize for something that he had done that offended some people. And I thought that was just an amazing example of how Presbyterian polity should work. We've had a lot of controversies in the PCA this year, right? A lot of you have probably heard about them. There was, Brian Chappell and the circumstances around his resignation. There was Erwin Ince, who's the M&A coordinator, and the circumstances around M&A's budget. They had an almost $2 million deficit last year. We talked about that for a good long time at the assembly. The circumstances around M&A's resource on immigration, and M&A's stance on ethnic affinity groups. We heard a speech and an apology from Brian Chappell and Erwin Ince, and I think they were good speeches. They were genuine, and we spent a lot of time, especially on Erwin Ince, debating whether or not we should vote him again to be the M&A coordinator. We even voted on his salary from the floor of the assembly. There was an attempt to lower his salary. interesting stuff. But I think ultimately we went in the right direction on all of that. Despite all of these difficulties, our denomination, I think, is healthy, and it's being reformed by Scripture. Sometimes we might daydream about like what we would do if we were president, right? What we would do if we ran the world. We might daydream about that. For me, General Assembly was a good reminder that you don't and you can't run everything. At General Assembly, you need to work together with elders who have very different views from you and with whom you might disagree vehemently. But you need either to persuade them or to come to an agreement or compromise with them. You don't always get what you want, and that's actually a good thing because I'm a sinner and I'm finite. And if I always got what I wanted, then things might not be very good. And it's kind of the idea that, you can't let good be the enemy of perfect. That was my experience this year for General Assembly, for sure. This is a lot different than churches that have bishops, right? A church like the Roman Church or the Episcopal or the Eastern Orthodox, they have one guy on top who, to put it simply, always gets what he wants, right? He makes the statement. He decides who is ordained. He does the thing. No, we have an assembly of over 2,000 elders on top, and they have to work together to find a way that serves the church best. Our way might be slower and a lot less efficient, but I'm convinced that it's not just more biblical, but that's actually better for the church, because in our diversity of views, we come to a resolution that serves a diversity of churches. And so that's what I was encouraged by this year. I think we made a lot of good decisions, a lot of good movement. Are there any questions about General Assembly this year? Yeah, we'll to Mark and then Sandy.
I was curious if there was any sense of awareness of or discussion regarding accusations that the denomination's on a liberal slide. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of that. I mean, obviously in regard to the response to the Revoice conference. And I mean, I've seen a lot of discussions, people saying, the PCA and sorry. Is it on?
Yep.
Okay.
That's better.
Did you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like an ongoing thing. The Revoice, so for those who aren't aware, that was a controversy in, I think it came to a head like 2019, 2017, something like that. It had to do with homosexual identity. Can you be, it was specifically, can you be a pastor and positively identify as a homosexual? And there were some in the denomination that said yes. And we dealt with that over a number of years. We passed an overture that amended the BCO that said a pastor needs to conform to the biblical requirement of chastity, not just in his actions, but in his words and his identity of himself, identification of himself. So I think we basically dealt with that. There are other things that might be concerning, but...
Was anyone wanting to combat those accusations of the slide? I mean, to me, I do a lot of reading, and I've seen a lot of people say, PCA there.
Yeah. Nobody talked about that, directly, I suppose. Yeah. That's not my impression of the PCA, I guess. There are some concerns. There are some churches that I think are, like individual churches that I think are heading in that direction. But as a whole, I don't think the domination is. Yeah. It might have been, honestly, something like 10 years ago with that Revoice stuff. But I think we successfully changed the course on that. So, Sandy, do you have a question as well? We'll have a mic.
How were the Koreans and the Mexicans and all those people doing? How are they? Are their churches growing? How's it going?
Yeah. So basically the fraternal delegates, right? I think overall it was positive reports from those fraternal delegates. We had one delegate from the Reformed Church in Quebec, which you may not know this, but we actually had a visitor from that denomination at our church maybe like a month or two ago. And when he was here, he told me they've only got 5 churches in their denomination. And I think 3 of them don't have pastors. And so they gave the same report at the General Assembly. They still only have 5 churches, and 3 of them are without pastors. So they're kind of in a rough place. There's not a lot of Protestant churches in Quebec. There's not a lot of Reformed churches in Quebec. But they're holding out as a faithful witness in that difficult region. So, any other questions? about GA or anything? Yeah, Minas over here.
You can just decline to answer this, but I was just curious. What are your thoughts about the Timothy Brindle
Okay.
incident?
Yeah,
and we can talk about it later too. But
Yeah. I assumed that this question would come up. I didn't address it directly, honestly, because in the room at the assembly, it was just kind of not a big deal. It's just one of those things that the internet has picked up and made a mountain out of a molehill, in my opinion. So the situation with Timothy Brindle, he was speaking in regards to Erwin Ince, the M&A coordinator's re-election to be the coordinator again. And he addressed the affinity group situation. And at a certain point into his speech, he started to venture into what I immediately recognized as he was doing it was breaking decorum. In other words, he wasn't speaking to the issue. He was speaking about Erwin Ince's motivations, possible motivations. I think the words were something like, if my brother doesn't feel safe with me in a room, something like that. And that's getting into issues of the heart. Like, Erwin Ince has never said that publicly. He's never said it privately, as far as I'm aware. So what I think most people in the room recognized was, okay, his speech is departing from what is appropriate at the floor of the assembly. And a lot of people stood up and they said, point of order, which means, something's happening that shouldn't be happening. And they tried to have Timothy Brindle ruled as being, I forget what the word is, but they tried to have him ruled in such a way that he would have to stop speaking, he'd have to apologize, all of that stuff. Instead of doing that, moderator DeYoung simply encouraged him to not make any personal accusations or address any motivation, but to keep decorum. And then I believe he was able to finish his speech. Time ran out shortly after, something like that. I don't think it was a big deal at all. I don't think this means that Kevin DeYoung is some progressive, effeminate, feminist. There are crazy accusations online about Kevin DeYoung because of that one situation. I think basically what's happened is some people saw it, and online they don't understand how Robert's Rules of Order work. They don't understand parliamentary procedure or Presbyterian polity. It just wasn't a big deal in the room. That happened multiple times throughout the assembly. Somebody's speaking and they start to speak into issues that aren't relevant, or they're speaking in a way that's not befitting of the assembly, starting to get into motivation issues, and the moderator says, please correct the way that you're speaking. Speak with decorum. It happens a lot, so I don't think it was a big deal. I think it was appropriate for the moderator to do what he did. That doesn't say anything about the substance of what Timothy Brindle was saying, but the way that he was saying it, the way he was trying to address the motivation of Erwin Ince in a way that Erwin Ince has never said those things, that's where that went wrong, and that's where Kevin DeYoung tried to correct that. So hopefully that addresses that. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them. You're happy to take emails or anything like that as well. Thank you. You're welcome. Mission to North America.